Avihing Sanon from HIV-NAT Thai Red Cross AIDS Research Center. On behalf of Professor Kiat Ruxrungtham, I would like to welcome all of you to the next important session. As all of you know that tuberculosis is still the most common infection in this region and resulting in around 850,000 patients die from tuberculosis each year. So today is a good opportunity for us to have a very great speaker to be with us today. So our next speaker, Dr. Frank Cobelens. He is a professor of global health at the Academic Medical Center, University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. He has extensive research on tuberculosis, and he published a lot of tuberculosis papers, including the study in China and Vietnam. He has served on several expert panels and advisory bodies of tuberculosis, including the World Health Organization Strategic and Technical Advisory Group of Tuberculosis. He also chaired the board of the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development and is a scientific advisor to QSNCC Tuberculosis Foundation. He is the best person to deliver us how we can ending tuberculosis globally. Thank you. Frank, please.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali, and thank you for your very generous introduction. I hope I can live up to that expectation. And of course, also thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about what is my favorite subject, which is tuberculosis. And I'm going to do that by talking about basically three things. I'm going to give you a sketch of the global tuberculosis epidemic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the WHO's new so-called NTB strategy, and then try to dive a little bit deeper into problems and needs, especially with regard to diagnosis, treatment and prevention. And this picture here is meant to remind me of the fact that I have to tell you that what I'm here to do is basically to set the stage for the subsequent presentations. But also, I have only 20 minutes, so I can only go through this by giant steps. So I hope you can follow me. The global TB epidemic. So this is the latest report. In a nutshell, in 2015, there were an estimated 10.4 million people worldwide who fell ill with new tuberculosis. People living with HIV accounted for 11% of that total. 6 countries accounted for 60% of the new cases, which is India, Indonesia, China, Nigeria, Pakistan and South Africa. So 4 of these countries are here in the Asian region. And in 2015, 1.8 million people were estimated to have died from TB, including 0.4 million among people with HIV, making tuberculosis rank in the middle of the top 10 of causes of death worldwide. This shows you the estimated incidence in terms of rates in the world, and as you can see, highest incidences are in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the south and the east, clearly related to HIV, but there are also very high incidences in a number of other areas, for example, Indonesia, Myanmar, Mongolia. This graph here shows you the HIV prevalence among tuberculosis cases in 2015, and it shows you that as we expect, this is highest in East and Southern Africa, and especially in Southern Africa, where it has really, HIV has really fueled a terrible tuberculosis epidemic. But you can see there are also other regions in the world where the co-infection rate is relatively high. For example, I mentioned Ukraine that you see up there in Eastern Europe. That is a country where I think there is a sort of perfect storm going on of HIV infection, TB due to a sort of concentration in IV drug users with very high incarceration rates, which increases the risk of tuberculosis transmission. This slide is meant, and this is numbers of estimated numbers of cases over the past 15 years. It's actually meant to show you that it hasn't changed an awful lot over the past 15 years in terms of incidence. It also shows you, as I already said, that whereas HIV, TB, HIV co-infection is a major problem clinically, a major problem in various parts of the world. On the global scale, HIV only accounts for a minority of tuberculosis patients. And the other thing that it shows is that the notifications, that's the black line of new and relapsed TB, has been increasing, which means that we are better at finding cases and notifying them. But there is a gap remaining here between incidents, estimated incidents and notification. And of course that incidence comes with uncertainty, as you can see. There is this uncertainty, area of uncertainty around it. That gap is a sort of mixed bag. It is a mixed bag of patients who have been diagnosed and are being treated but are not notified. For example, in countries with a large involvement of private sector of TB treatment, such as, for example, in India. But there is also, a part of this is also patients who are diagnosed but are never started on treatment, so they remain with tuberculosis. And there will be patients who have tuberculosis and in the end die from tuberculosis, or who self-heal. Actually, spontaneous cure still, it happens. We know that from the sort of old pre-chemotherapy days. This is showing you basically the distribution by age and sex on the left, global, and it shows you that about 2/3 of TB patients worldwide are men. It also shows you that children under 15 years of age constitute about 7% of all incident cases, and on the right, by WHO region, you see that it doesn't really vary an awful lot across those regions. This is giving you an idea about age distribution of TB. And I contrasted here Asia and Africa, because you can see in Africa the sort of peak age of tuberculosis, and this is rates per 100,000 population. The peak age is really the middle age, and that is probably to a large extent driven by the HIV epidemic, whereas here in Asia you can see that in many countries the peak is actually in the elderly. It's an epidemic in the elderly. And you can also see on the bottom that Thailand is actually very close to China in terms of the age distribution. And I think the two epidemics in the two countries are also similar. This is about the drug resistance problem. You will hear much more later about drug resistance. This is about MDR TB, multi-drug resistant TB, or TB just resistant to rifampin, which is the sort of mainstay of first-line therapy. And this is giving you the percentage of patients who have MDR TB. And you can see that now the picture is different. Now the big problem is in the former Soviet Union. And you see, and that is really a worry, that in China also numbers are increasing quickly. But this is proportions. If you look at total number of patients, the MDR epidemic worldwide is actually also very much driven just by sheer numbers of patients. And you can see here that actually India has the largest number of estimated number of MDR patients. And the WHO has come up with a new list of what they call high burden countries. It's a little bit complex because it's a combination of countries that have very high numbers of patients of these particular types of TB. So it's either all tuberculosis or MDR TB or TB HIV co-infection. But in the list there are also small countries that have small numbers of patients but very high rates, very high population rates. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. But the reason that I show you this is that in the countries right in the center, those are the countries where these problems all come together. Several of them are actually here in the region, such as China, India, Indonesia, Myanmar, and should probably count Papua New Guinea to that as well. This slide you have more or less seen, but this is now by region, and this is not by numbers but by rates. And the reason why I'm showing it you is that whereas TB treatment and diagnosis saved millions of lives over the past 2, 3, 4 decades, it hasn't really done much in terms of ending the epidemic or bringing down the epidemic. You can see wherever we look, there is only a modest decline, especially for the green line in TB incidence. So, and why is that? Why is that despite all our efforts? I think it has to do with this. This is my favorite graph for TB to explain what TB is about. What it shows you, and this is data from about 10 years ago, but WHO now published a sort of revised version based on very recent data. But I like this because of what you see next. This gives you on the y-axis the tuberculosis notification and on the x-axis, the per capita gross domestic product, so the indicator of how well the economy does. And it shows you on a log scale that there is a sort of perfect linear association between the two. These are countries, these are all countries. But then if you do, and that's what I did, that's why I used these data, if you reanalyze it and just put it on an ordinal scale, this is what you see. So you see that when countries move from very poor to middle-income countries, you see the TB epidemic almost goes away. So, and this is not only TB, better TB control, it is also the economy. And we see that everywhere in TB. We see this is from two household surveys we were involved in, one from Vietnam, one from Bangladesh. Actually shows you exactly the same. Households that are in the lowest quintiles of wealth, of household wealth, have the highest prevalence of tuberculosis. We see that everywhere. And we also see that in affluent countries, it is the poor, it is the disenfranchised that have the highest TB risks. And it also works the other way around. TB has a major impact on people's livelihoods. This is data from a study from KNCV, from Susan van den Hof, looked at 3 countries, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Kazakhstan. I'm not going to explain you the complete slide, but it is telling us that if you compare people's income before they became ill and during their treatment, you see that there is always a tremendous drop in income, whether that is measured as personal income or household income, whether that is for normal TB or MDR TB. So it has major effects. That is for a disease or for a treatment of which we think, of which we all say, that treatment and diagnosis are provided for free. So even while it is provided for free, it has major economic implications. That's because people cannot earn an income, and it is because people have all sorts of additional costs. This is one of the reasons why in their new strategy, WHO has put much more emphasis on universal health coverage. This is the new strategy. The new strategy, called the NTB strategy, started in 2015, has as its vision a world free of TB. 0 deaths, 0 disease, no suffering due to TB. The mission is to end the TB global epidemic, and these are, it's a bit similar as in HIV, it's not entirely 90-90-90, but it comes close. The targets to be achieved in 2035, so that's only 18 years from now, is a reduction in the number of TB deaths by 95%, a reduction in TB incidence rate by 90%, and 0 catastrophic costs for TB affected families. And this is what this is how the WHO envisaged to do this, by having integrated patient-centered TB care and prevention, build policies and supportive systems, and have, I think, very important intensified research and innovation, but then also do that in the sort of context of government stewardship and accountability, building strong coalitions with civil society and communities, protecting, I think very important, and promoting human rights, ethics and equity, and make sure that countries actually do their bit. But this is not going to happen just by only these things. We need a couple of new things here. And this is a slide that everybody who's talking about TB will show you this slide. So what you see here, these are modeling projections, and the line at the top is the current global trend, a decline in incidence of 1.5% per year. Now, where we want to be in 2035 is there. What we can hopefully achieve with what we currently have, so that's our current diagnostics, current drugs, things that are currently in the pipeline, and make sure that with universal health coverage, protect patients by social protection, then we could potentially get a 10% decline every year. But we need to go beyond that, so we do need new things. We need a vaccine, we need new drugs, new treatment regimens. We need to do more about latent TB infection. This big reservoir of people who are latently infected and can become diseased, and a point of care test. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about these things. So this is the problem, I think, in a nutshell about diagnosis of TB. TB is a chronic disease with insidious onset, non-specific signs and symptoms. Diagnosis requires bacterial confirmation, which, if it is smear examination, has low sensitivity. If its culture is very slow and very cumbersome. If it's gene expert, is relatively expensive. Diagnostic sensitivity is further reduced in HIV infection, children, and extrapulmonary TB, which means that patients are diagnosed late, and I'll show you a bit more about it in a minute, or not at all. So what do we need? We basically need to diagnose more TB patients and diagnose them earlier. So we have to improve access to diagnosis. We need more accurate and affordable tests. We need to have them closer to the patient, more point of care-like. We need to involve all levels in the health sector as well as communities. We need to screen actively for disease, for TB disease, high-risk populations such as contacts of infectious TB patients. You can think of households, schools, people living with HIV, potentially diabetes patients. Diabetes is a risk factor for TB, prisoners. But we should perhaps do more. We should perhaps have sort of triaging of patients in clinics and active community case finding. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these two. So the triaging thing is basically about this. So this graph is from a systematic review of 51 studies already a couple of years ago. But the picture is, I think, has remained more or less unchanged, which gives you the delay in days between onset of symptoms and when these patients are diagnosed. And you can see that about half of the patients have a delay between 2 and 3 months since the onset of symptoms. So generally long diagnostic delays. And when you look at that closely and you interview patients, you actually find out that most TB patients have visited several health facilities before being diagnosed. And they've often visited the same clinic where in the end they are being diagnosed more than once. The majority of TB patients, by the time they are diagnosed, have extensive symptoms, which means I generally say they have TB written on their forehead. I mean, if you miss that diagnosis as a physician, well, then you really should go back to medical school. But that means that, in fact, it means there are many missed opportunities for diagnosing TB, and new diagnostics, such as expert, sort of still holds the promise that they can improve that, but they are basically being underutilized. They are not being utilized in a sense that we can find patients earlier and more of them. So one way to solve this could potentially be a triage test. Now, what is a triage test? A triage test is basically something that's very simple, that's inexpensive, has a sufficiently high sensitivity, but not necessarily high specificity, because it's not meant to make the diagnosed TB, but it's meant to triage patients from low probability that this patient has to be to high probability, and those with a high probability would then have the more expensive tests such as GeneXpert. And we actually did cost effectiveness analysis for that in the context of rollout of GeneXpert, and it really improves the affordability and the cost effectiveness. So it actually allows you to do this sort of scale up. There are a number of options. CRP is one, hemoglobin is one, IP10, or potentially others. The other issue is this. This is, I think, one of the most remarkable findings over the past years. That this is from prevalence surveys, and prevalence surveys are household surveys in which basically everyone who's in the survey gets a chest X-ray and then is asked about TB symptoms. This actually shows us that a large proportion of those who in the end are found with tuberculosis, and this on the right-hand side, you're bacteriologically positive, so they have a positive culture, that a large proportion don't have typical TB symptoms. And actually, that's even true for smear-positive patients. They are infectious. They may actually be highly infectious. So there are patients, well, they're not patients, they don't have symptoms. There are people out there who have infectious tuberculosis and are basically not diagnosed because they don't have symptoms. They don't come forward to a clinic because of symptoms. So should we be more active about them? Should we do community screening? And then the question, because they don't have symptoms, is basically, does it have impact on transmission? And of course, always important for a poverty disease, is it cost effective? Now, here the evidence is conflicting. There have been only very few comparative studies done. Only one randomized controlled trial was the ZAMBARD study in South Africa and Zambia, and that didn't show an effect on transmission. There have been several modeling studies done, and that do suggest that community screening can have substantial impact on transmission and be cost effective. But a recent large exercise, spearheaded by the Gates Foundation, in which all sorts of modeling groups were asked to look at this issue from their modeling perspective, and that looked at a whole package of interventions, not just this, but a whole package of interventions, actually showed that for the countries where this was done, China, India, South Africa, if you would combine it with other interventions, it wouldn't be really an advantage, neither in terms of impact and in terms of cost effectiveness. Treatments. You're going to hear much more about this, but I'll just kick off. What are our problems? First-line treatment, patients with drug-susceptible tuberculosis, it takes too long. Duration is at least 6 months. This is due to the so-called persistent state organisms, if we are willing to believe they exist at all. achieve actually very high cure rates, but completion rates are variable. That's really where the problem is. We see high mortality in patients with HIV infection and CD4 count that hasn't really been solved. And we see increasing drug resistance. For second-line treatment, so that's for MDR-TB and XDR-TB, you'll hear more about that later, it's even longer. It's 20 to 24 months with very variable cure rates, complex treatment, highly toxic drugs, poor completion rates for these and other reasons. There was really light at the end, or very near this tunnel, that WHO approved a 9-month regimen with very good cure rates, but that has restricted indication. Not all patients can have it. And it's difficult to decentralize. It's hard to scale up, which also means that we remain stuck with high costs for patients, for example, for transport. And there are problems with regard to resistance testing and prognosis. We have this expert test, which also tests for rifampin resistance, which is great, but we don't have molecular assays that can give us a rapid result for other drug resistances. And we cannot predict who will cure and who only needs short duration of treatment. Well, hopefully Professor Paton is going to tell you a little bit more about that, but basically not all patients need 6-month treatment. Probably only a minority, but we don't know from the outset who is in which category. So that is a problem that needs to be solved. So what is needed? We need to substantially shorten the first-line treatment. That could, for example, be done by increased dosing of current drugs, such as rifampin, or new drug combinations, as the ones you see over there, spearheaded by the TB Alliance. We need to scale up quality treatment for MDR and XDR-TB. We need to improve completion of treatment and adherence to treatment. We need, wherever that is possible, to introduce that 9-month regimen and do the appropriate drug resistance testing that comes with it, and reduce cost to patients and provide social support where needed. We need to simplify, shorten and improve the safety and tolerability of second-line treatment, which means we need new drug combinations. Actually, a lot of work going on here, so I think there is really hope. And ideally, we would have a magic bullet regimen, which is a regimen of drugs to which there is no resistance, so we can use it in each and every case. And then we need to expand access to drug-resisting testing, so we need new, rapid and easy-to-perform assays. And an important thing in drug development here, and this is really different from the HIV world. In the HIV world, you can do tiered pricing. There is an incentive for companies to invest in drug development because of the resource-rich market. That is not the case, or hardly the case, in TB. So TB is an unattractive market for drug development with little opportunity for tiered pricing, which means we need new models to fund research and development in that area. Now, finally, for prevention. I think prevention is where we really, in the end, need to go, but also where we have a lot of open questions. First of all, we cannot prevent TB transmission. There's no condom for TB. There's no way we can stop people breathing. No, we can't say. So TB is not about behavior. TB is about living your life in the context in which you live and getting infected. There is no vaccine that is effective against adult pulmonary TB. We have BCG, works great in infants, there's nothing in the adults. And that comes with it, we have no immunological correlate for protection. That was actually shown very clearly in this paper over there, in the MVA-85A trial, a phase 3 vaccine trial of a vaccine that had great results in terms of immunological outcome in phase 2B and completely failed in phase 3. It didn't do anything in terms of preventing TB, which means that we're currently stuck with doing large-scale phase 3 trials with clinical endpoints. And at the same time, we don't have a way to select promising candidates because we don't know what we need to look at. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. Preventive treatment, I think, is a very important one. It protects against progression from latent TB infection to TB disease, but we cannot identify with sufficient positive predictive value who will develop disease and who will not, which is particularly important if we want to scale up in HIV-negative populations. And in HIV infection, preventive treatment needs to be probably lifelong if it's isoniazid, or if we have other combinations, may need to be repeated to prevent reinfections. So if you look at the isoniazid preventive treatment, this is the current status of rollout. you see that's still rather poorly implemented. And especially if you look here at the region here, the Southeast Asian region, only about 10% of those in need actually get it, for a variety of reasons. But I think preventive treatment is really where we should look into more, and that also has to do with this, that we are moving from an old paradigm of TB, which was a dichotomous paradigm. You had latent infection, no disease, and then all of a sudden you got disease, and that's it was an on-off thing. There is increasing evidence that that is not the case, actually much more complex. So this is the famous graph by Cliff Berry. So, and it shows that on the top you have, so you basically have a continuum from clinical disease to something like sort of subclinical pathology, infection controlled with some bacteria persisting, and then actually infection eliminated. By now we have much more indication that we can actually eliminate infections, not only through the acquired immune response, so with T-cell priming, but also through the innate immune response. And there was actually, and this is, I think, the most important paper that came out in TB last year, was the paper by Hanif Esmail from South Africa. Actually a small study. They looked at 35 people HIV infected with latent TB infection, in the sense that you could find that with the quantiferon assay. They had no TB, they were without symptoms. They didn't have very low CD4 count. They did PET scans on them. And these kind of PET scans, they give you an idea about the amount of inflammation that's there. They followed them up for 6 months. There were 10 patients who actually had clear abnormalities on those PET scans. So they had inflammation. And it was clearly shown, and that's the survival graph over there, that those who had that subclinical pathology basically went on to develop overt TB over a period of 6 months. So that means that there exists something, and we are really acknowledging that now, as subclinical or incipient TB, probably infectious to some extent. I'm almost done. So the issue with prevention is there are many unknowns, and actually we don't have sufficient understanding of the natural history of TB. It's completely different as for HIV. I mean, you can still go into TB and win a Nobel Prize, because there's an awful lot of work to be done here. So where are the uncertainties? The uncertainties are with regard to susceptibility to M. tuberculosis infection. We know from the old days that about 50% of those who are highly exposed to TB escape infection. We don't know why. We don't know the determinants. We don't know what drives spontaneous clearance of infection. If you look at progression from infection to disease, we know predisposing factors such as HIV, diabetes, smoking, but they are not sufficient to explain why one person in the end gets TB and the other doesn't. So maybe there are sort of triggers that we don't know about. We don't know, and that's the sort of pathological underpinning of that, we don't know how granuloma integrity, granuloma being the pathological hallmark of late infection, is maintained. We basically know still very little about early, you may call it subclinical or incipient tuberculosis. Perhaps we can identify TB in a very early stage and then prevent overt disease and transmission. And perhaps a test that would identify this would be an ideal test. And then finally, we don't know what the respective roles are of innate and adaptive immunity. And probably, both in sterilization and in clinical immunity, probably innate immunity is much more important than we always thought. And that brings me to my last slide. This is the vaccine pipeline. This is the updated by IAROS. And actually they acknowledge this themselves. This looks like a very healthy pipeline. Like, great, we have many, we have one in phase 3, a couple of in 2A and 2B. They are all based on the same principle. They're all based on T-cell priming. And it may be that that is not the answer. It may be that we need to have a completely different paradigm if we're ever going to have an effective TB vaccine. Conclusions. Despite 25 years of intensified TB control efforts, TB remains a major cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide, compounded by HIV co-infection, drug resistance and poverty. There is now an ambitious effort to not just control, but to end the TB epidemic in the coming decades. This requires optimized use of and expanded access to the technologies and tools we already have by strengthening health systems and reducing economic burden to patients. But it won't be enough. We also need better diagnostics and drugs and an effective vaccine. And all this requires better understanding of the natural history of TB, including susceptibility to infection and drivers of disease progression. Thank you.
So
Thank you very much, Frank. So we will save the question at the end of this session. It's okay. So I would like to move on to the next speaker, Professor Nick Paton. He is chair of infectious disease at the National University of Singapore, where he is working on program on TB research focused on developing novel endpoint for tuberculosis trial and on evaluating new TB drug combination. So he's gonna tell us about the new TB treatment strategy and new monitoring tool for effective tuberculosis control. And if you can do that, you will be a next Nobel Prize recipient, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for that kind introduction to Professor Paton and the organizing committee for the invitation to speak. Let me just start off publicly expressing my condolences on the passing of the King. I've understood, as I've, over the last 30 years that I've had interactions with Thailand, a very special relationship between the King and the royal family and the people, and especially the strong support and interaction of the royal family and the work of HIV-NAT and the Thai Red Cross. So I understand it's a really a big loss. So I've been asked to cover new drugs and new strategies. I've decided to sort of link the new drugs to MDR TB and the new strategies to drug-sensitive TB, mainly to have some structure to the talk, because obviously they overlap, but it would be even more chaotic if I didn't try and have that structure. So this is what I'm going to do. So this is the current global TB drug pipeline. And if we look at phase 3, yeah, that arrow's working. So if we look at phase 3, there are 6 trials in phase 3 at the moment. A rifapentin trial, which is for drug-sensitive disease. All of the others are for MDR. A delaminid trial, 3 bedaquiline trials, and a pretomanid trial, which is currently stopped. So I'm going to focus mainly on bedaquiline and delaminid as the trials. So starting with bedaquiline, this is a really exciting, I hesitate to call it a new drug, but anything in the last 10 years in TB is regarded, I think, still as new, and we're still excited about it. So this works against a great target, ATP synthase, which is an essential target in both actively replicating and persistent dormant bacilli, which is what we really want to target. And these are the licensing data. So they're all typical studies. You look over time at the proportion of people who are culture positive in the sputum, and this is the optimized background regimen for MDR with a placebo, and this is with bedaquiline. You can see a very spectacular clearing, sterilization of the sputum with bedaquiline. There was a sting in the tail. This is the survival data, and the colors are not around the wrong way. Actually, there was a survival disadvantage in the early trials with bedaquiline. It was a very small number, 2 deaths in the placebo groups, 10 in the bedaquiline. And when you look at the range of causes of death, there's nothing that really looks like a drug toxicity coming out. So it was almost certainly a chance finding and hasn't been replicated in subsequent studies, but certainly it was cause for concern. So the FDA, when they granted an accelerated license for bedaquiline in 2012, based on this phase 2 data, put a black box warning on bedaquiline about the deaths, although that concern, I think, is receding now. This is the same kind of data for delaminid. Sometimes, just to confuse people, you flip the direction of the axis. Here was sputum culture positive or sputum negative, but this is the delaminid arm. It's actually clearing the sputum again faster by a very dramatic amount, and bedaquiline got a license from the EMA, the European licensing agency, but not the FDA, based on that data. So both of these accelerated licenses with an expectation of doing substantive phase 3 trials to follow pretty much immediately afterwards. Now, as you all know, to find a new drug is incredibly time-consuming process and extremely expensive, and that money doesn't come very often in TB. So what we have to do is also look at repurposing drugs, and this is actually becoming a very successful endeavor. This is one of the big exciting things. This was linezolid, found to be very effective in extensively drug-resistant TB patients. So this is people who got linezolid immediately on top of a standard regimen compared with delayed administration. So you look in those 60 days, a spectacular takeoff with linezolid, which kept on going, and the same in the delayed linezolid arm. So also looks very promising for linezolid, a widely used and now generic drug. Just last year, the beta-lactams have been a long-standing question in TB. Are they effective? Are they not effective? There are problems about intracellular penetration, all sorts of other limitations. But this is really exciting data. This is just a 14-day colony count study in the sputum. And what you see here is the standard decline with the standard combination is drug sensitive. But these people just had intravenous meropenem, nothing else. And you can see a very impressive several log reduction in the colony counts in the sputum. So this has really reawakened the whole interest in beta-lactams in TB, and there's now an awful lot of work going into this, including NIH-funded and other grants going to be looking at this. So I watch this space. I think beta-lactams, very exciting. So what I've shown you so far is all about getting data on individual drugs, potentially to get a license or to get repurposing. But actually what we need for TB is combinations, and we need a different approach for that given the limitations of money and so on. So some investigators have used an interesting approach to combination regimen development where essentially they've tried a regimen, they've watched carefully, it's still good science, they've watched carefully, looked at the outcomes, and then tried again with something else, looked at the outcomes, and in doing that they actually struck lucky. They managed to find a very effective regimen that was just 9 months in duration. And this cured 80% of people on this 9-month regimen as opposed to the less than 50% with the standard therapy. And that was borne out in a subsequent cohort in Bangladesh and has now been tested in a range of cohorts in Africa and a few in Asia. Which again showed equally good results with this 9-month regimen. So last year, the WHO came out with this announcement of a new, shorter MDR-TB regimen, just 9 months. Really a big advance. And what's in this regimen? Well, it's the usual we use for second line, so an injectable, kanamycin, a fluoroquinolone, moxifloxacin, plus some drugs from first line. But probably the key component of this regimen that's led to this stepwise change in sterilization is likely to be clofazimine, an old leprosy drug which has been repurposed for TB, and possibly also the high-dose use of moxifloxacin in that. So this new shorter TB regimen, the WHO has attached a number of conditions around that, so it's by no means applicable to all. So if people have been exposed to any of those second-line drugs or have resistance, then it's really not appropriate to use that shorter regimen. You need to use the standard approach of 18 to 24 months of drug selection. Also, it still means 4 months of injections, which people don't like, even with this 9-month regimen, and the toxicity tolerability concerns with some of the drugs, particularly the skin pigmentation with clofazimine. And, still, this is XDR-TB, but a number of people have pre-XDR, so that means resistance to a fluoroquinolone or an injectable. So actually this regimen is not by any means suitable for everyone. So we still need to resort to this sort of shopping list of drugs for second-line therapy. So the WHO has actually just updated this at the end of last year. Still the same approach for MDR-TB. So you start at the top with the core drugs and then work down the list. So if you've got susceptibility to quinolone, use that. If you've got susceptibility to an injectable, use that. What they have done is create this extra group of core second-line drugs in which clofazimine and linezolid have appeared. So you go down the list and use those first of all, and then you notice when you get down here, here's bedaquiline and delaminid. So if you really can't construct a regimen with 5 drugs within this lot, then you may get to use bedaquiline and delaminid, but they're not right up the top of the list at this point of time. So, and it sort of, maybe I'm not accustomed to this from the HIV field, but this is the wording in the TB guidelines, surprisingly frank, I think, for WHO, about the quality of the evidence for these regimens. The quality of the evidence is graded as low or very low, which means, ladies and gentlemen, we're relying on expert opinion with all of its limitations. So when you see these guidelines, remember it's these groups of experts who are interpreting it for us, but I think we can also be creative and need to be creative in how we do these things. So that having been said, there's actually now a lot of very good quality studies, or a number of very good quality studies coming along which will provide the quality evidence base. So there's the STREAM trial, which is the definitive comparison of the WHO 18 to 24 month standard regimen against this new 9-month regimen, which is fully enrolled in follow-up, and we expect results early next year, so not too long to wait for that, which will be important and exciting. The delaminid phase 3 trial, again following a standard design that they used for the phase 2, so you just give whatever's current in the background and then delaminid or placebo on top of that with clinical outcomes. That's completed enrollment too. It's actually completed follow-up, so we're actually waiting for the results. It should be out any time, so that will be exciting too. And then the bedaquiline phase 3 is finally underway. There was a lot of criticism about the delay it's taken from that license in 2012 to actually get the trial underway, but actually I think they've come up with an intelligent design of the trial that's going to be actually quite informative. So what they're trying to do here, so there's 4 arms in this trial: the WHO standard regimen and the 9-month regimen as control arms, because we're not sure actually the WHO 9-month regimen is still, we don't have the evidence, concrete evidence, hard evidence that it's superior. And then there's a 9-month regimen, but they're using bedaquiline to replace the injectable, which is the bit that everybody really dislikes, to have a fully oral 9-month regimen. That would be an important advance. And then look here, there's one that shrunk to 6 months for drug-sensitive TB, where they've kept the bedaquiline, they've kept the fluoroquinolone, they've kept the injectable, and used bedaquiline to replace some of the perceived to be less potent drugs in the regimen. So both of those would be really interesting developments, but we need to wait until 2021 or thereabouts to find out the answer for that one. And there's some other bedaquiline trials in MDR-TB, also just to mention, I haven't got time to go into them, but they got bedaquiline linazolid and this new drug patrominid in one of those, so also interesting. So that's all I'm going to say about MDR-TB and the new drugs and how they kind of fit in. But I think it's, I think there's good hope on the horizon. We just need to be patient. Things don't move too fast in TB, but the evidence is going to follow. Now let me switch to new treatment strategies, and I think this is more challenging and perhaps more interesting, and I see if I can lead you through some of these things. So we actually have a really good regimen, as you all know, for drug-sensitive TB, and it's available as a fixed-dose combination, and by and large it works with HIV medicines too, so that's terrific. It does have one problem, and the big problem, and that's the main drug in the regimen, the most potent one, as with all powerful things, comes with some problems, and that's the interactions, the multiple enzyme inductions with rifampicin. And most of the time we can get around that, but occasionally it does act as an obstacle to what we want to do. But that's not really the reason why we need to change the first-line regimen. As Frank has mentioned, the main problem with the first-line regimen is its duration. 6 months is really too long, and people stop taking the medication. That's what breeds the drug resistance. And really what we should be trying to do is shorten the first-line regimen to 2 months. I think that's a aspirational but realistic goal. I think 10 days is somewhere in the fantasy land. That's definitely Nobel Prize material, but I think unfortunately it's that's fantasy. So why do we need 6 months? The answer is because of these persister organisms. So what happens when you give TB drugs is the bacteria, they go into this persister state and essentially they become resistant to the antibiotics. So very hard to treat, and then when you stop the antibiotics, if any of them are still alive, boom, they wake up and then start a new disease process going. So that's why we treat for such a long time. We're trying to obliterate every last one of those persister organisms. So what new strategies might we use to do that, or to move on from this strategy? Well, we can look at antibacterial dosing, and as opposed to the HIV thing where dose optimization is trying to reduce doses to minimize toxicity, in TB we're trying to actually increase doses, increase efficacy so that we can shorten the regimen, so a different approach. Perhaps increase antibacterial treatment adherence, that's an Achilles heel of all regimens. Look at adjunctive therapy to enhance the immune response. And then the last one is look at fundamentally at what we're trying to do and see whether we're barking up the wrong tree. So the first one, dose optimization, a lot of interesting work, especially from the Netherlands. Martin Borre is leading this, looking at increasing the dose of rifampicin for better sterilization. And this is just out in Lancet ID right at the end of last year, which showed that if you give 35 milligrams per kilogram of rifampicin with the standard drugs, that's 3.5 times the standard dose of 10 milligrams, you can actually produce almost a doubling of the clearance rate at 8 weeks of treatment. So that's actually a spectacular change that's not been seen since the advent of rifampicin 40, 50 years ago. So that's very exciting data, and that needs to be pursued in phase 3 trials. What about adherence? Really important. So as you know, an essential part of the WHO's treatment strategy is directly observed therapy, this idea of a patient coming to be watched taking the medicine. So there's no possibility that they're not taking the medicine. Patients do not like this. It's paternalistic, it's inconvenient, and in some places, well, and also, of course, it may not be great for public health if you force people to get on a crowded bus every day or sit in a clinic to be watched taking their treatment if they've got TB. May not be terribly wise from a public health point of view. There are also other limitations. If you're an urban person in Bangkok, actually coming every day for directly observed therapy is a challenge. And if you're a rice farmer, how are you going to get the directly observed therapy that way? So big problems with this concept. So here I'm showing you one thing we've developed in Singapore is a mobile phone application, so people can stay at home and each day they can take their pill, they can send a video to a central server, a healthcare worker can sit and at the end of the day look through however many people on your program, 20, 30, 50, 100, and review all of those videos and see whether everybody's taken their pill. And we can link that up with reminders at the time they're supposed to take it, etc., etc. So we've developed this in Singapore, and I'm hoping that with the HIV-NAT group we're going to be trying that in Bangkok too. Turning to the immune response, it makes absolute sense if you're having difficulty clearing those persister organisms because the antibacterials don't work, why not get the immune system to work on your behalf? And the oncologists have now, for the last decade, developed this idea of using the host immune system to clear your disease. Why haven't we done that in TB up until now? I think we should have done, but it's finally started. A lot of work on immune-based therapy. I just show you one example because most of it's just starting. This one's just finished, and I happen to have a bias because it's a trial that we've been running in Singapore and the region. IL-4 is a key cytokine in the Th2 response, and it probably serves to keep the bacteria in the persistent state. You probably don't need it because you can clear with the antibiotics, and this may be counterproductive. And in animal models, if you give monoclonal antibodies to block IL-4, you can actually clear the TB faster. So we have done a study on that in Singapore, which we just completed, where we have to be with these immune-based therapy studies because in infectious disease, one has to be very, very careful. So we've used a dose escalation thing, start very, very low, almost homeopathic doses, worked up to make sure that we're not causing any harm. The good news is we've got through the study, we don't appear to cause any harm from our perception. We haven't unblinded the data yet, but nothing catastrophic has happened. And now we need to look at what the efficacy is. And this just shows you we've had to rethink the way we design TB trials. So as well as the standard collecting sputum for outcomes, we've got to do all this immunology stuff, transcriptomic signatures, very specialized immunology tests, and also you see the blue bar in there, PET MR, PET CT scans to follow what's happening immunologically with the disease. So those results will be out midway through this year. That'll be one of the first real targeted immune-based therapy studies. It'll be very exciting to see what that shows. So lastly, let me turn to this very radical approach about rethinking the way we do things. Now, we use 6 months therapy, as I said, because we're trying to clear those persister organisms. But actually, if you look back at the old data, if you look back at the 2-month studies done in the 1980s with standard drugs with streptomycin, with 2 months of therapy, you could cure still the majority of people. So more than 80% cure rate with 2 months of therapy. So what this means is we're giving 6 months. The vast majority of people do not need 6 months. They're cured after 2 months, and they're just having drugs, taking drugs without needing it. We treat because of the few people who are going to relapse. I would dispute with Frank. It's a pair of papers. I like this paper, also based on PET-CT, also from the same investigators, came out last year in Nature Medicine, which I think really underpins this approach. What they did was they did PET-CT scans in patients who are undergoing treatment for TB, and whereas we think, at end of 6 months treatment, we've cured someone, we stop therapy, they found a very different pattern. If you follow what's going on with the inflammation in the lungs, yes, some people resolve completely after 6 months, but they're in a minority. A proportion improve, but you still see inflammatory changes after 6 months. And then some people have a mixed response. So it responds, and then you look at the end of the treatment, and you've got big areas of new inflammation in the lungs. And even more striking was they looked a year after completion of therapy. And in some people who were asymptomatic, there were new areas of inflammation lighting up in the lungs. So what this is telling us is that even with the standard 6-month therapy properly administered, where we think we stopped treatment, we cured people, actually we probably haven't. All we've done is restore some kind of equilibrium. So what essentially we're doing with our standard treatment, we're using a sledgehammer to try and crack a nut. We can deal with this with much shorter treatment for most people. And sometimes, in fact probably in the most of the cases, the nut is winning. Okay? So what we really need to do is reassess our objectives. Should we really be trying to obliterate these persistent organisms, or can we perhaps have a more intelligent approach where we're trying to rebalance between the organisms and the immune system? So you treat until you've restored that equilibrium, the host immune response is in charge again, and that's fine, as long as you follow people afterwards to make sure they're fine. All right, so this is, as a result of this, is our new strategy. So the idea is perhaps we could treat for a short period of time for everyone, for 2 months. You stop treatment, unless people are still symptomatic, they obviously have florid disease, then you would extend or switch to standard treatment. But let's say you treat for 2 months, they're well, asymptomatic, everything fine. Stop the treatment and watch closely. Not watch closely and carry on ramming treatment down the throat, but watch and see what happens. And if people who relapse should do so very early. We know that from the other treatment shortening studies. If you give short treatment, you relapse very quickly afterwards. So if you're still in follow-up, you can identify the people who would then need a standard, much longer period of treatment to restore that balance. And the other assumption behind this is that these relapses will be drug sensitive. Everything in the past literature points to that. So when people take short course treatment, they take it properly. If they relapse later, they relapse with drug-sensitive disease, and that's amenable to treatment with the standard therapy. So this is a new approach, and this is the name of the trial, the Truncate TB trial. We're hoping, it's at a very advanced stage of preparation, it's funded. We're hoping also to be able to run this in Thailand with HIV-NAT. We've got approvals already in Philippines and in Indonesia, ethics approvals, and in Philippines regulatory approval, and Singapore. So it should be starting soon. I think this will turn the field of TB on its head. Even if it doesn't work, we will learn so much from this trial that I think it should advance our understanding of TB and what we're doing. So this is my summary slide. So I've walked you through new drugs, and particularly their application to MDR-TB. We've got some new or repurposed drugs with really great potential. We've made some empirical changes to the standard regimens, which also look good, and the evidence will follow, in some cases soon, in some cases after another few years. And for drug-sensitive TB, we're doing pretty fine, but actually there's a number of new strategic approaches that may also hold promise. So let me just, in my concluding slide, thank all of the people in the team in Singapore involved with the studies I presented, and with some of these thoughts and discussions, and with our collaborating sites. Thank you very much.
Division of Respiratory Medicine, Central Chest Institute at Nonthaburi, Thailand. He's TB expert in Thailand. So today he will tell us about the new diagnostic and touch on some latent tuberculosis treatment.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee to give me an opportunity to be here. Actually, this topic I talked in 2 months ago in the APCASO 2016 meeting in this room also 2 months ago. It's the same topic. So this is a very important issue in the tuberculosis. And not recently, 2 years ago, 2015, the WHO launched a new guideline to implement the LTBI in the NTP, National Tuberculosis Control Program. And I will try to make in short that everybody talk about the latent tuberculosis infection. I myself confused with this term because when you look at the natural history of infection in the patients, 90% of the infected person will not develop any disease for the whole life. So it means that the bacteria in the body die already after the infection. But some people, the bacteria still survive in the body and develop disease in the future. So 90% of infected person will not develop disease. So this group of patients will not benefit from the LTBI or any treatment. But usually the current guideline, most of the guideline in this world recommend to use prophylaxis, or now we call it LTBI, latent tuberculosis infection treatment, in everyone who have a tuberculosis test positive, or everyone who tests that he or she had already infected with a tubercle baseline. So I think that we have to differentiate between the person who infected with the baseline and the baseline still survive or viable in the body, whatever the form that the bacteria stay in the body. But most of the infected person, the bacteria already die after the infection. So this is a new idea to draw a new test. So differentiate between the viable bacteria in the body. Currently, we use two tests to differentiate between the infected or not infected person. And recently, just a few weeks ago, CID published a new recommendation from the ATS and CDC, the diagnosis of tuberculosis. And they mentioned that they recommend to use the IGRA as a first line in that guideline. And the alternative is a tuberculosis test. For the IGRA, we have to test the quantiferon, Gold, Till, and T-spot. A new test that in the process of investigation is a quantiferon Gold plus, a new generation of the IGRA quantiferon. And the gene expression pattern, I personally believe that the gene expression will be the standard test of LTBI in the future. I will show you some that cytokine response T cell activation. I will not talk in these two techniques so much about that. But quantiferon launch out a new test, quantiferon Gold plus. The reason that they developed this new test is to determine the response of CD8 T cell, because actually the CD8 T cell play some roles in the immunity against the TB, and the CD8 T cell correlate well with the bacterial load in the body. When you treat the patient with antibiotics or anti-TB, the response will decline regarding to the number of the bacteria. And the new test called quantiferon Gold plus, they cut the 7.7 antigen out, and they use a short chain of E6CFP10 as a simulator antigen to simulate the CD8. And the reason they try to develop the test that can differentiate between the active disease and LTBI, or infection and active disease. Because currently we recommend to do the test to test whether it's infected or not infected. We cannot use the test to differentiate between the active disease and the infection. So they try to develop that. And unfortunately, the publication from Japan, Professor Morley from the IIT, showed that the quantiferon Gold plus seems to be less sensitive than the quantiferon Gold Till. The reason is that they cut the 7.7 antigen, which is a very potent antigen. So the response, the sensitivity was low in the quantiferon Gold plus than the quantiferon Gold Till. And when you look at the TB2, the T2, it seems to be that the less sensitive. And again, quantiferon Gold plus the new version. So it's not approved by the FDA now because maybe this lower sensitivity. But another publication in the ERJ showed that the quantiferon Gold plus response related to the closeness of the index case and the patients. I showed you this one. Yeah, you look at this one. Quantiferon Gold Plus has higher sensitivity than when the patient and the index case stay with the test case longer than 12 hours per day. And also when they stay in the same room. So it means that the closeness of the index case and the patient who the contact case. So maybe it's benefit the closer the likelihood to have an active disease. But that this is not true. That I mean that the author did not mention that this is the direct correlation, but it just shows that the higher the positivity of the quantiferon Gold Plus means that the cross of the contact to the index case. Gene expression is promising technology now, and I think that this is a technology that we use in the future to differentiate between the active disease and also the LTBI or infected person who will develop the active disease in the future. And this is a publication in 2014. They study a lot of genes. Now it's very easy in the lab to study the expression of the gene by looking at the RNA. And it seems to be that the gene expression, they select several genes, and it seems to be that the gene expression, the panel, the profile of the gene expression is more sensitive than the IGLA and the expert in terms of detection of the active disease. So this studies show the gene expression to detect the active disease in the children, because in children they don't have a sputum for us to do the smear and culture. Very, very difficult to do the sputum examination or specimen examination in the children who suspected to have a tuberculosis. But this just draw the blood, test in the lab, and keep some data, calculate into the score, and you can predict that, oh, these children is a high likelihood to develop active disease or diseases in the body. So, and which is a difference between the culture positive, highly probable case, and possible case and other disease. And this one is very interesting, published in 2016, last year. I like this paper very much because when you look at the group cohort of the patient to 6,000 cases and 3,600 cases had a quantiferon positive or tuberculosis test positive. And then 2,300 cases had a tuberculin skin test and quantiferon negative. But when you look at they follow up this group of patients for a year. Only 60 cases develop an active disease. So when you calculate that, it's only 0.5% of the tuberculin skin test positive and or quantiferon positive will develop the active disease in the future in 1 year, in 12 months. So current guidelines said you have to give the prophylaxis or LTBI in this group of patients, and you just prevent only 60. It's not 100% protection, maybe you can prevent 40% for 40 cases. So, and you see that in the tuberculin skin test negative or IGLA negative, you have 27 cases develop active disease in 1 year. So this is a less 0.1%. So this is like a natural history in our clinical practice, that when you have a tuberculin skin test positive or IGLA positive, you still have a very low probability to develop active disease in the future. So we should be very careful to give the prophylaxis or LTBI to the patient. And they study the profile of the gene expression, and they can get a 66% sensitivity to detect anyone who develop active disease in the future. So it's likely like that. It's like this that you can do the gene expression in any person who suspected to have a contact of the TB, and you look at the profile of the gene expression, and okay, this is a high likelihood to have a active disease in the future, so you give the prophylaxis to this group of patients. And this is a study, and when they use in another cohort, they got a sensitivity of 53%. So, and a group in Ministry of Public Health Thai and Department of Medical Science, a group of scientists, Dr. Surakhame developed a test. This is a panel of the test that used in Thai population. Okay. And in Thai patients, they look at the MAFB and Caslin gene expression. And this gene expression related to the response of the treatment. Because after this is the first, after 1 week, with the treatment, they demonstrate that the expression of the gene decreased by the test. And this group of patients develop a test kit, gene expression test kit. And they calculate into the TB6 score and can differentiate between the active TB and previous TB and a healthy person. And this test will develop will launch out as a routine test in the Department of Medical Science in the next 6 months. So it's very interesting to have this test in the clinical practice. So you can find anyone who need the LTBI. That's a new test. Another study that it's not promising. I saw only 1 or 2 publications that look at the microbacterial specific cytokine response. And in this paper published in AJRCCM, they can, in the paper mention that we can differentiate between the infected person and uninfected person by looking at the response of the interferon response in the interferon gamma level IP10, TNF alpha IL2. And we look at we can differentiate between the LTBI and disease, infection and disease by looking at the response of these cytokines. This is a guideline of the WHO. Now we come to the treatment. This is the guideline of the WHO 2015. They compare the isoniazid and placebo. It seems to be that prophylaxis can reduce the active disease. And the IH is a good drug because it has a low hepatotoxicity. And look at the rifamycin compared to the isoniazid. It seems to be that, yes, rifamycin is a good drug. But now, when you look at the prophylaxis, you have to use isoniazid for 6 and 9 months. It's not practical. When you talk with the patient, okay, you have to treat it for 9 months. And the patient will ask you, oh, if I want to treat as an active disease, just only 6 months. Prophylaxis is longer than the treatment, so it's very difficult to convince the patient to take this medication. Do we have another alternative? Yes. Rifapentine and isoniazid. This is a publication in 2006 in AIGHD journal last year. Because in US, they use a lot of rifapentine and isoniazid, 12 dose, high dose, 12 dose in 3 months. And before this publication, there's no any study study the benefit of this regimen in the HIV patient. But this paper published in 2006 showed that in the HIV patient who have a high CD4 count, rifapentine isoniazid high dose, 12 dose in 12 dose weekly, have the same benefit as as 9 months of isoniazid. And when you look at the completion rate, you see that the I think this is something wrong. As completion rate. I think there's something wrong. Okay, I will check it again. But it should, the 3HP should have a higher completion rate, and because it's a big, I think that that's something wrong. Sorry. And the last slide, the last paper that I would like to show you is very important, because when you implement the LTBI, it's very important to look at the cost effectiveness, the cost benefit of the regimen. And this is from Taiwan, published last year. When you look at, because in 2016, Taiwan launched out the program to provide the rifapentine as a 3HP rifapentine and high dose isoniazid for Taiwanese contact TB patients. And in the control group with the isoniazid, 500 cases and 100 cases of rifapentine group, you can see that the completion rate of the rifapentine group is higher than the standard 9 months regimen, significantly. And the side effects seems to be less in the rifapentine group. And you look at the grade 2 and the side effect, overall side effects of this two regimen. It seems to be that, not seems to be, the rifampicin arm has a less side effects. But I think that the most important thing is this slide. When you look at the money that you have to spend to prevent one active disease, for the 3HP or rifampicin group, you spend only 5,000 Taiwan dollar. As compared to the 9 months, $15,000, 3 times higher. So I believe that the rifampicin high dose isoniazid 12 dose weekly will benefit and will make the LTBI LTBI latent infection treatment program success in the future. But the problem is that not so many countries have this rifampicin on the drugs was not registered in many countries. Even in Thailand, in the process of registration, and you need about 1 or 2 years. And its benefit in HIV patients also. For MDR contact, no, we don't have any drugs. The problem is that most of the experts recommend to use the pyrazinamide, but in the review, pyrazinamide has a very high resistance rate in the MDR strains, from 20 to 90%. And this is a problem that some experts don't like to use this shorter regimen as recommended by WHO because the high pyrazinamide. Even the propaganda show that the resistance against the pyrazinamide will not effectively resolve the shorter regimen. But the high resistance rate in MDR prevent the use of this pyrazinamide as a drug for the LTBI treatment. Quinolone, very promising. We need a clinical trial, and I think that the Phoenix studies will answer these questions in the future. This is a publication in 2014, and they use moxifloxacin and levofloxacin as a prophylaxis in the MDR-TB contact in Micronesia, which is a small island in Pacific Ocean. And they have a MDR case, and there's spread in MDR in the island. And when you look at the result of the study, typically on the right-hand side, the typical test positive patient, 119 patients, 104 cases received accept to get the quinolone and ethambutol prophylaxis, and nobody's developed an MDR case. But in another 15 cases which refused to get the prophylaxis, 3 cases, that's a 20% develop MDR just in 1 year. So this is a very important issue that for the MDR-TB contact, do we have any drugs to use or not? No any clinical studies or in clinical trial to show any benefit drug. But this is just a preliminary data or observational study to show that quinolone is a good drug for the prophylaxis of the MDR-TB contact. Okay. So in summary, no any new test for LTBI approved by the authorities at the moment. Typical synthetic and IGRA is a standard, and in the US they prefer to use IGRA. But IGRA is very expensive. Gene expression is promising technology in the future. And we hope that in the next few years we have the commercial kit will launch out and we can use it as a test to determine whether any person who need or benefit from the LTBI. 12 high dose of isoniazid rifampicin is a good regimen, and it is practical to use and the cost effectiveness. And no standard LTBI for MDR at the moment. That's my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next exciting presenter, so her name is Rodelyn D Marte. She is a Filipino feminist activist with a passion for human rights, sexual rights, and social justice issues. Rodelyn is currently serves as the executive director for APCASO. So today she's going to tell us what the role of community to ending AIDS. So, to ending tuberculosis. So, Rodelyn, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good afternoon, everyone. I was just noting the list of speakers, and I was messaging my friends in the office and saying I'm quite tickled pink to be the only non-doctor in the panel. With that to note, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the issue of community and civil society role in ending tuberculosis. Before I begin, I'd just like to introduce briefly my organization. APCASO, we're a regional civil society network of community-based and non-government organizations that work on HIV, health and social justice with a focus on advocacy and supporting the capacity development of communities, particularly those that represent communities most in need, namely people living with HIV, sex workers, people who use drugs, men who have sex with men, transgender people, migrant workers, mobile populations, including young people and women within these populations, so that they're able to advance a rights-based social development and health agenda. APCASO also currently hosts the Global Fund Community Rights and Gender Communication and Coordination Platform for the Asia Pacific. We're also an affiliate and the host of the Global Fund Advocates Network, which aims to help the Global Fund secure resources for responding to HIV, TB, and malaria. And we're currently the host and happy to announce the co-convener of a recently established group called ACT Asia Pacific. This is the Asia Pacific Activist Coalition on Tuberculosis. Just to provide a segue to the main content of my presentation, I would just quickly refer to a few slides. Two slides from two different presentations of Dr. Mukta Sharma, who is a friend of civil society from WHO Thailand. So one is just a slide from her presentation on drug resistance in WHO, trying to highlight the challenges in detection, in TB detection. So one, she highlights that one, resources are still limited. For example, Global Fund, which is the biggest multilateral agency which funds tuberculosis, AIDS, and malaria, only 18% of the Global Fund funding is allocated for TB. Second, there's an overburdened health systems and fragile, if at all, existing social support systems. Third, there's inadequate lab capacity, and when it exists, this is highly centralized. There's a low uptake of rapid diagnostics due to cost. Next is that there's still pervading discrimination in the healthcare sector against people who's infected by TB. Lastly, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to adherence patient support mechanisms, which are often poorly developed. And then when it comes to TB drugs and diagnostics, she made the conclusions that new developments in TB do not translate adequately into access for patients because there's a lot of cost and legal policy registration issues. There's definitely a need for civil society and community advocacy. It's critical. It's not yet happening in the TB space the way that we've seen it happening beautifully in HIV, for example, and changing the way things happen. And lastly, there's a push for more research funds for TB that also needs to be made. I'm presenting just these two slides just to make a point because I'm challenging everyone to think of the key challenges and issues in ending TB and drug resistance, accessibility of drugs, and then think of any solution to these challenges that does not entail contributions from community and civil society. Because if anyone tells me that there's a way to end the TB epidemic without the meaningful engagement and contribution of civil society living with or key affected by the disease. So this includes TB survivors and patients, prisoners, people who use drugs, people living with HIV, people with diabetes, minors, healthcare workers, children, and mobile populations. If any one of you would tell me that we could end the TB epidemic without meaningful engagement of these communities, I would challenge you and say that you are simply wrong. So just to try to give an overview of what I see as community roles in ending TB, and I wouldn't say that this is any different from the role that communities and civil society have been playing in other development sectors and in other health issues and would continue to play. And at the end of the day, it's really challenging we're not happy with the status quo. We know that a lot of things need to happen, so we challenge the status quo and provide an alternative and contribute towards reaching that alternative status quo. So there's definitely a role for communities and civil society around advocating for improved TB services, TB diagnostics, for lowered prices of drugs, for accessibility of medicines. There's a lot of role for civil society in terms of monitoring, supporting resource mobilization to make sure that there's evidence-based allocation of resources externally from donors and also within countries that commensurates to the gravity of the disease. And we know at the moment that this is just simply not happening, and we have to question why. There's also a very big role of civil society and community in terms of making sure that TB service delivery becomes more effective. And specifically in terms of service delivery, there's a lot of evidence, and we know from experience that a shift to community-led approaches is the only way wherein, one, we can scale up basic program interventions to the level that are needed, because if we involve communities and civil society and key populations, it's the only way to reach hardest to reach populations. And we know that in TB, there are key populations who are affected by the disease. This is also the only way to keep people accessing services, diagnostics, and adhering to treatment, and for the cost not to spiral out of control. We've seen this happen in other diseases, and we know that it's also true for TB. There's also a lot of space for civil society and community to ensure that the human rights of people that are affected and infected by TB are maintained, and the quality and the dignity is maintained in all the process of diagnostics, treatment, and adherence. Having that as a context, I would just like to call the attention of all of you to a group that I've mentioned a while ago. It's the 8 Activist Coalition on TB in Asia Pacific, or ACT Asia Pacific, which APCASO and the Global Coalition of TB activists convened. This came out of a meeting last December, wherein we said like we needed a coalition of civil society actors in the region who would push for working for effective, people-centered, rights-based, and sufficiently and strategically resourced TB responses. We know, I mean, at least from the perspectives of community and civil society, the TB response is highly medicalized. And we know that, of course, there's that huge role for medical practitioners to play in TB, but we also know that the civil society has to be brought along the process if we are to end the epidemic. So ACT Asia Pacific is the region's first TB activist coalition, and it emerged from a meeting that we convened it's still in its baby stage, just last November, where we had representatives who are TB and drug-resistant TB survivors, grants, organizations who receive grants from various funding institutions to implement TB projects, representatives from WHO and Global Fund, and from regional and national HIV networks that are affected and key populations for TB. So we consider the formation of ACT Asia Pacific as highly timely, particularly in the context of our region, as mentioned in the beginning of this session, accounting for over 850,000 TB-related deaths each year. That's a lot of deaths. And having 10 multi-drug resistant TB high-burden countries, and where access to treatment and diagnostics remain a significant challenge. When we convened ACT Asia Pacific, cognizant of the challenges and the roles of civil society and community in ending TB, we agreed that as a group of committed civil society and community, our commitments to action is one, acting together to give TB the political attention that it deserves. The reason behind this is that TB, as we know, or we may know, is now the #1 infectious disease in the world, with Asia Pacific bearing the biggest brunt of infections, and the world has the means to prevent TB deaths and disabilities. But the fact that the world fails to do so is highly inexcusable and violates principles of human rights, social justice, public health, and sustainable development. TB continues to fall dismally low in the world's and even in our region's development and political agenda. And again, we question why. Is it because those affected are people who are poor? That's why it's also getting very little political traction. So through ACT Asia Pacific, we want to enjoin the international and regional development communities, government funders, researchers, and civil society movements, including those from PLHIV, treatment access, anti-poverty groups, human rights, women's rights groups, right to food, people with disabilities, to give TB the political attention that it deserves, matched with the resources needed to reach the global goal of ending TB by 2030. And we are also calling very loudly for greater effectiveness in TB HIV responses integration, because we know that this is a key to an effective TB response. I don't think HIV responses will be effective when it hasn't brought TB along, and the same is true for TB as well. Our second commitment to action is to present an alternative model to the pervading biomedical approach to TB. We said that we will advocate for TB responses that, one, is centered on people and supports the meaningful participation of communities in all levels of the response. To look at TB infections among communities and make it people-centered. We're dealing with humans, we're dealing with people, and not just diseases. And TB responses that, secondly, respects, promotes, and advances human rights, including of TB populations. And lastly, TB responses that ingrains gender equity and gender transformative policies and programs as a critical means to an effective TB response. So we're saying that these are interventions or approaches to TB responses that are not just nice to do, but are actually critical in putting up an effective TB programs and responses. Thirdly, we've committed to acting together to overcome barriers to TB treatment and diagnostics access, a very big problem, not only in our region, but in the world. We will work to build the needed support from different stakeholders to overcome key challenges to universal and equitable access to TB drugs and diagnostics. And these challenges include high prices, essential health technologies remaining out of reach for millions. We've seen how advocacy and activism of civil society groups in other disease areas have resulted to the lowering down of prices of drugs, and we hope one way or another we will be able to work with those groups for it to trickle, those kinds of effects to somehow trickle also to TB medicines and diagnostics. Another challenge that we want to address when it relates to TB treatment and diagnostics is the weak health and community systems capacity, weak supply chain management and procurement, inefficient drug regulatory controls, slow movement and low investments in TB research and development, discrimination in the health sector, as I've mentioned already a while ago, poorly developed adherence and patient support systems, and absence of informed and mobilized communities and activists to challenge and demand for change in the status quo. The fourth area of action we committed to do is around securing adequate and strategic investments for TB, making sure that these investments go to the right interventions, including by communities. So basically, making sure that money for TB go to evidence-based interventions, not only in interventions that are either convenient to do or popular to do, but even interventions among criminalized or marginalized populations, the funding needs to reach them, even if it's not a popular choice. So within 1 year of our formation, ACT Asia Pacific aimed to secure core and program funding for the network because we believe in the power of collectives such as ACT Asia Pacific to foster solidarity, cross-learning and support, and to coordinate and inspire joint advocacy from civil society, which we feel is needed in the TB response. We're also looking at putting together or helping put together what we call as FACTS, F-A-C-T-S, $, which is the Funding Champions for TB. This is a funder counterpart of ACT Asia Pacific, whose members will commit to funding and mobilizing resources for TB. So as you may know, there are a few funders who are interested in funding TB, and we hope we'll provide a common platform for them to work together and inspire other donors. We'll also support civil society advocacy and capacity development in the regional membership as well as in counterpart partners within countries in the region. If we are able to get resources to support their capacity development for effective, strategic, sufficient, and sustained community-centered rights-based TB investments. So to support similar counterpart advocacies for mobilizing resources for TB within the countries, for the governments themselves to invest in their own TB responses. So this is for both domestic and foreign donor sources. Lastly is the commitment of the group to act to support a coordinated and capacitated TB community and activist movement. We are organizing ourselves for better representation in platforms such as this, so we really appreciate the space for being able to engage in this meeting, and leadership in TB framework setting, policy development, advocacy, program implementation, and monitoring at global, regional, national, and local levels. I'm happy to note that recently the WHO Task Force on TB has recently put together a civil society group to advise the work of WHO in the area of TB. APCASO is one of the members from the region. It's a small panel of about 10 people. There's 3 people, civil society people from the region. It's a good start. It's still hard some are doctors, some are not doctors, but to engage and to influence that space. But that's a very welcome action from the WHO that civil society perceive. I am thankful that I'm able to present the commitments of civil society actors in the region in terms of contributing to the TB response regionally, globally, and nationally. And we do call upon all of you to support our work and to also represent that we're very ready and very eager to work with counterparts from the government, from the medical societies, so that we do end TB in this lifetime. Thank you.
So thank you so much. So because we ran out of time, I'm sorry that we don't have time for the question, but our speaker will be outside, so if anyone wants to ask their question. So I would like to thank all the great speakers for this section, and we have about 20 minutes break, and please come back on time so then we can leave on time, okay? I know that everyone wants to go home, but we still have final important section. Please come back. Thank you very much.